A slow machine can kill faster than a fast man if it owns the ground first. Bren Orwick knew that before the steel arm crossed the white safe line at Red Mesa. Brindle knew it another way. Teeth on canvas, paws locked in dust. The lockdown clock had started. Marin Quill was standing where the map said safe, and the machine had just changed its mind. The boundary rag snapped once under Brindle's mouth. Not loud, not dramatic, just a dry little scrape of canvas against grit. The sound should have vanished under the hydraulic whine, but Bren heard it because Brindle never wasted his jaw. The German Shepherd had planted himself sideways to the marker line, chest low, shoulders hard, leash running tight into Bren's hand. Sunlight burned white along the steel arm. Heat rose off the lane in thin shivers. Marin's left boot sat half a step inside the painted safe strip where any clean map would have left her alone. Clean maps were nice. So were fairy tales and other things that got people killed. A yellow heat flag shivered on a pole behind her, lazy and useless. The test horn had not sounded yet. The men at the observation rail still held clipboards, tablets, coffee, all the small civilized objects people carried when they believed danger had been scheduled for later. Bren watched the boot before he watched her face. He caught the rag first, pulled 2 inches off its usual angle. Then Brindle's front paws dug into the dust as if the line itself had tried to crawl away. Then the steel arm, slow and low, not swinging wild, not failing like machinery in a training video. It was just taking more space than the lane had promised. Marin looked down at the dog with the irritated confusion of someone whose world still had rules. Her hand lifted toward the marker pole, maybe to fix it, maybe to prove the dog had lost his mind. Bren felt the leash bite deeper across his palm. Brindle's eyes cut back to his hand. A quick check, no fear in it, only pressure. That was the cue. Not truth, not prophecy. Edge. Move, Bren said. Marin turned toward him a fraction too slowly. The steel arm hummed over the dust behind her, and the shadow under it widened by inches. Bren stepped across the line before he had permission, before proof, before anyone from the observation side could call the lane hot or cold. His knee complained when he pushed off, a sharp old note under the newer heat. He ignored it. Bodies had timing, machines had timing. Pain could take a number and wait its turn. He caught Marin above the elbow and drove her toward the high side. Not hard enough to throw her down. Hard enough that she stopped being polite about balance. Her boots dragged through powdery dust, one heel skidding off the white paint, the other knocking a clod of sun-baked rubber from the marker base. She gasped once, more angry than afraid, which was fine. Angry people kept air in their lungs. "High side," Bren said, and shoved her behind the raised strip. The steel arm crossed the place where her ribs had been. It did not smash. It did not roar. It passed with a flat metal scrape and a low hydraulic growl, slow enough to see every inch of the mistake. That made it worse. Fast danger excused confusion. Slow danger asked why everyone had stood there and believed a stripe. Dust jumped from the ground under the arm's edge. The boundary rag twisted in Brindle's teeth. Marin stared at the empty space, then at Bren's hand on her sleeve, then at the white line that had just lied to her in public. The air moved with it. Not wind exactly, more like the lane taking a breath through metal teeth. Bren felt the vibration through the soles of his boots and up into his bad knee. Marin felt it too. Her shoulders tightened after the arm passed, late but honest. Nobody cheered. That helped Bren trust the moment. Cheering came after people understood what almost happened, and nobody here understood a damned thing yet. Brindle released the rag only when Bren gave him 2 fingers down and a low click of the tongue. Even then, The dog kept one paw pressed near the marker, body angled between Marin and the low ground. "Brindle is not mad at the rag," Bren said, mostly to Marin, partly to the three men on the observation side who had gone stiff and useless. Marin swallowed dust. Then what is he mad at? Bren looked past her, across the heat shimmer and the bright, stupid openness of Red Mesa. On the far berm, a small recovery cart had shifted position. Two figures near it moved at the same time, not running, not panicking. Adjusting. That was the word Bren hated. The steel arm settled at the end of its sweep as if nothing had happened. The lane marker hung crooked in Brindle's wet mouth print. Ground told truth before people did. This ground had just changed its story. Bren had seen men dress panic as procedure. He had seen procedure dress itself as certainty. Both looked clean from a distance. Up close, they left boot marks in the wrong place. Orrin Hitch Calder arrived from the observation side with dust on his boots, a tablet in one hand, and the expression of a man who had just watched physics insult his paperwork. He did not run. Orrin never ran unless blood or gravity had already made a better argument. He came down the high lane at a hard walk, eyes moving from Marin's sleeve to the crooked boundary rag, then to Brindle's paws still planted near the marker. Bren let him look. The steel arm had settled at the end of its sweep, low and patient, sun glaring along its edge. Marin stood behind the raised strip with both hands open at her sides, as if touching anything would make the lane lie again. "Tell me you pulled her for a reason better than dog opinions," Orrin said. His voice came dry, but not light. Bren watched the low ground behind him. A couple of test staff had started drifting forward, drawn by the human need to inspect danger after it had politely missed them. Brindle stiffened before Bren had to speak. The sun pressed down so hard the metal seemed white at the edges. Nothing about the lane looked dramatic now, which made it uglier. Bad ground did not need music. It only needed people tired enough to trust paint. "High side," Bren said. Brindle moved with him, one hard step across the marker line, blocking the first man's boots before they crossed into the low dust. The man stopped, offended by the dog, which was better than being crushed by certainty. Orrin glanced at the staff, then back at the tablet. The approved lane overlay sat bright on the screen, all tidy margins and cheerful little tolerances. The real lane sat under their feet, hot, gritty, and less impressed. "This marker was good at 09, Orrin said. "I signed the lane. I did not sign this." Bren looked at the white strip, then at the steel arm's resting position. "The machine did not miss. We did." Orrin's jaw worked once. Old habit. He hated admitting bad ground, and hated more when Bren was the one pointing at it. He crouched near the marker base, careful now, one boot on the high lane, one toe testing the powder at the edge. Brindle watched that toe like it owed him money. The phrase came out flat, not clever. Bren had no room left for clever. His palm still felt the leash burn from the first pull, a red line under grit, and Brindle kept checking that hand as if the dog could measure doubt through skin. The second sweep started before Orrin finished matching the overlay to the ground. No alarm first, no clean reset, just a low hydraulic pull through the frame and a tremor under Bren's boots. The steel arm drew back a fraction, paused, then came forward on a line that should have cleared the high lane by a comfortable margin. Comfortable margins were another little joke humans told themselves. The arm did not cross where it had crossed before. It pinched the high side, shaving usable ground from the raised strip and pushing a curl of dust over the white paint. Orrin saw it. Marin saw it. Even the offended staffer saw it and stepped back without waiting for the dog to embarrass him twice. Brindle braced and gave one short, ugly breath through his nose. Bren tracked the sweep edge, the dust jump, Oren's foot, Marin's boot behind the high strip. The movement had not repeated. It had answered. That was worse than failure. Failure had randomness. This had timing. On the far berm, the recovery cart rolled 6 feet left, slow enough to look administrative. The staff radios popped with half-finished calls. Somebody asked whether the lane was frozen. Somebody else said to stand by, the 2 sweetest words in the language if the goal was to die while being processed. Dathan Vey stood near that cart in a pale hard hat, one arm lifted in a small signal to a crewman by the service cut. From this distance, he looked like any recovery operator trying to keep a live test from turning expensive. Useful cover. Everyone loved a man who appeared to be solving the mess he had helped arrange. Bren could not prove that yet, and proof mattered if he wanted more than a fistful of dust and a fired dog complaint. Oren lowered the tablet. Brindle has better lane discipline than half the engineers, he said. Nobody laughed. Good. The steel arm settled again, heat ticking in the metal. The high lane was narrower now, by less than a boot length, which was plenty in a place where slow steel had opinions. Marin bent and looked at the marker without touching it. It changed after you moved me, she said. Bren kept his eyes on Dathan's cart and the fresh track it had cut across the berm dust. No, he said. It changed because someone needed us to move. Brindle leaned into the boundary rag again, and this time Oren did not tell him to stop. Oren's mouth tightened at that. He knew the difference between a bad reading and a bad lane. He also knew the ugly middle space where a lane could be made bad by men who understood exactly how much doubt a machine could hide. Red Mesa did not need darkness to hide an edge. It had glare, powder, and men trained to trust paint. The range stayed bright, bright enough to hurt, bright enough for every person on the lane to believe the edge could be seen if they stared hard enough. But the second sweep had dragged a low brown veil across the white strip, and heat shimmer bent the steel arm's shadow until the boundary looked soft. Bren kept Brindle on a short line at his left knee. The dog moved 2 steps, then slowed, nose cutting down and away from the rag, paws feeling for ground that no longer gave a clean answer. That hesitation mattered more than a bark would have. Brindle liked rules. He liked edges. He did not like guessing. Dust clung to his muzzle and made a damp crescent near one nostril. Bren tasted grit on his own teeth and felt the leash twitch once, not a pull, not a refusal. A question. The high lane narrowed behind them. The low ground sat open and inviting, which was exactly why Bren distrusted it. Open ground had killed plenty of men who thought they had room. Stay high, Bren said, and pointed 2 test staff back with one hand while keeping his eyes on their boots. People hated being aimed like equipment. Too bad. Equipment at least stayed where a man put it. Marin heard the command and stiffened. She had dust across one cheek and anger doing useful work in her eyes now. Fear had hit her late after the steel arm took her space. Anger came cleaner. I can walk without being hauled, she said. Her voice stayed even, which made the line cut better. Bren glanced at her boots, not her face. Then walk where the machine can't use you. Use me? Low ground, soft edge. It wants bodies down there. It doesn't want anything, she said. It's a loader. Oren gave a short breath that might have been agreement yesterday. Not now. He held the tablet lower, useless shine in his hand, and watched the dust crawl across the paint. Bren knew what Marin meant. Machines did not want, but pressure had direction, and direction did not need feelings to kill you. He almost said that. He did not. Long sentences were luxuries. Marin shifted half a step on her own high side, proving the point and resenting him for making it. Oren started to say something about the overlay, and the lane punished him for optimism. The steel arm woke with a dull vibration, not a full sweep, just a correction, a settling movement through the mount that carried more authority than the voices on the radios. Dust lifted from the low ground and slid over the painted strip like water over a curb. Brindle backed one step, shoulders tight, then stopped with his head angled toward the center of the lane. He did not commit to the rag. He did not commit away from it. Dirty Q. Bren saw Oren's toe still near the powder line and snapped 2 fingers toward the high strip. Oren moved before pride could argue. The arm did not reach them. It did something worse. It made Bren's last mental picture useless. The edge had been there, then the dust softened, then the small correction stole another slice of certainty. A boot length, maybe less? Enough. Marin saw it too. Her mouth tightened. The staff behind them went quiet in the awful way people did when the map on the screen and the ground under their feet stopped speaking the same language. The interruption left a pocket of stillness, hot and gritty and false. Bren used it. "Do not stand where the machine wants you," he said. Marin looked ready to object again. Then her eyes moved past him toward the component cradle near the loader body. Not the steel arm now. Not Brindle. The cradle. She stepped sideways, careful this time, and crouched without crossing the line. "That marker is wrong," she said. Oren was already turning. "Which one?" "Cradle alignment. That yellow tab should be flush with the mount plate. It's off." Bren followed her sight line. A small yellow marker sat on the cradle frame, half obscured by dust and glare, shifted just enough that a bored man would miss it and a frightened one would forgive it. Oren wiped dust from his tablet with his sleeve, looked at the cradle, then at the low ground cut beyond it. The old humor left his face. "Mass does not care who filled out the form," he said. This time, it sounded less like a joke and more like confession. Bren felt the lane widen in his head in the wrong direction. The steel arm had not only pushed people. Something near the cradle had moved or had been made ready to move. Heavy things left honest hints. Small lies rode ahead of them. Marin stayed crouched at the edge of the cradle zone, one hand hovering over the dust instead of touching the marker. Bren liked that. Touching evidence before knowing what it meant was how people turned one bad sign into 3 useless ones. The yellow tab sat crooked against the mount plate, not much, but enough to make the dust around it lie in 2 directions. One trace ran clean from the cradle toward the loader body. The other feathered low toward the service cut where Dathan's recovery cart had shifted earlier. Marin leaned closer, squinting through glare. "It didn't vibrate loose," she said. "Not from that sweep." Oren came down beside her with more care than usual, tablet tucked under one arm now, as if the screen had finally lost the argument. Brindle waited behind Bren's knee, restless in the heat, nose working at the dry metal smell. The dog had gone quiet. Too quiet, maybe. Bren felt the hot grit inside his boot and the old line burning across his palm from the leash. The whole lane seemed to hold its breath, which was nonsense. Lanes did not breathe. People did, and every person there had started doing it wrong. Oren crouched low, then stopped before his knee crossed the dust-soft border. He looked at the cradle, the marker, the low cut, and the steel arm's resting angle. The old teammate in him wanted to swear. The safety lead in him wanted numbers. The rigger in him saw weight. Bren saw the moment it landed. Oren's mouth changed first. "That cradle was supposed to settle high," he said. Toward the loader body? Marin asked. Toward the high side, Oren said. Away from that cut. Bren looked down the low ground. The service cut was not dramatic. It was ugly in the normal way of work sites. Tire grit, baked ruts, a slanted strip of shade under a rack of steel plates. A place people stopped noticing. A place a heavy thing could be made to go if enough ground was stolen from everyone trying to stand in the way. Where the weight wants to go, Bren said. Oren nodded once. Not happy. Yeah, and right now somebody is teaching it bad habits. The steel arm ticked as heat moved through it. Bren kept waiting for an official voice to say the lane was frozen. Instead, the radios gave them static and fragments. The object sat half-shielded by the cradle frame, bigger than the tidy name anyone had given it. MGA, 7 Mobility Guidance Assembly, sounded like something a committee had invented to keep fear out of a budget line. In the lane, it was a mounted block of dense housings, bracketed steel, sealed panels, and enough mass to make the ground confess. Not a file. Not a code. Not a little case someone could tuck under a jacket and stroll away with. The thing itself had to move. Bren did not know the full price of it, or who had promised what to whom, and he did not need to. The route mattered first. Dathan's recovery cart moved again at the far berm, slow enough to insult everyone's intelligence. A crewman by the service cut bent over a ground plate, then straightened when he saw Oren looking. Too smooth. Too much like response. Marin followed the motion and spoke without lifting her eyes from the cradle. They're not coming to us. Bren watched Dathan raise one hand, small and calm under the pale hard hat. The gesture carried across the heat shimmer like a hook. No, Bren said. They're making us come off the line. A horn sounded from the observation side, short and late. The kind of warning people used when the thing warned about had already started eating the room. Oren listened to the radio at his shoulder, then looked at Bren. Partial lockdown is starting. Partial, Bren said. There's a word that has never saved anyone. Cradle locks after sequence, Oren said. Once it pins, that assembly stays in custody until full release. He did not make it legal. He did not need to. Physical was worse. If the cradle sealed with the MGA-7 still seated, Dathan lost the window. If Dathan could drag it far enough into the low route before then, the team would be chasing mass through ground the machine had already made bad. Bren looked at Brindle. The dog's nose had lifted toward the steel arm, not the rag now. Heat shimmer curled off a dull patch near the inactive side, carrying a bitter machine smell under the dust. Brindle took one careful step, then paused. Bren felt the leash change in his hand. A real cue. Maybe a dirty one. Marin was still watching the crooked marker. Oren was watching where the weight wanted to go. Dathan's crew was already moving like men who knew the clock had finally become useful. Heat came off the inactive side of the steel arm in a bitter curl, thin enough to miss if a man believed only the moving parts could hurt him. Brindle did not miss it. The dog's head turned first, then his whole body, one shoulder dropping as the leash went hard across Bren's palm. Not toward the crooked cradle marker. Not toward the low service cut. Toward a dull patch of metal where dust had baked into old residue and shimmered like wet glass under the sun. Bren felt the cue through the line before he finished naming it. Breath change. Paw shift. Nose high, then low. Real. Time was narrowing. The partial lockdown horn had already made the lane feel smaller, and Dathan's crew was moving with that ugly confidence men got when a clock started helping them. Oren watched the low route. Marin watched the cradle tab. Bren watched Brindle and felt the old rule tighten in his chest. Ground told truth before people did. Dogs, good dogs, pointed at the part of the truth humans were too busy to see. The heat smell had teeth in it, hydraulic and sour. Bren trusted the cue because it was real and because they were running out of ground to distrust. "Edge is dirty," Bren said, and moved them toward the higher intercept, away from the residue patch and the low service cut. It made sense in the first 3 seconds, which was usually how bad choices earned a uniform and a clipboard. Brindle resisted once, then came with him, nails scraping dust over the paint. Bren put Marin behind Oren, pushed Oren toward the high strip, and kept Brindle between them and the steel arm's resting reach. He did not explain the heat. He did not have time to explain anything. Dathan's recovery cart had shifted lower, and a crewman near the cradle bent into the glare as if checking a plate. Bren read the dog, the heat, the route, the narrowing lane. One line. Too tight, maybe, but clean enough to act on. "High side," he said. Marin started to speak, then swallowed it when Brindle gave a rough breath and cut his nose back toward the heated patch. Oren moved where Bren pointed, but slower now, trust bruised by the last 2 bad readings in the lane. The steel arm ticked above the dust. Bren felt its vibration in his boots and used that rhythm to place everyone. 1 more step. 2. If the ground held. The ground did not hold. Not the way Bren meant it. The heat patch was real, but it was old contact, residue baked onto a dead side of the arm, a ghost of movement, and not the root. Brindle had marked pressure. Bren had made it direction. The difference cost them before he could pull the thought apart. Dust burst from the low cut as Dathan's crew dragged the component path another few feet forward. The MGA-7 shifted in the cradle with a dull clunk that traveled through the lane like a bad word. Oren turned toward the sound and put his boot into powder where the high strip had already narrowed. He recovered, barely. Marin grabbed his sleeve, not graceful, useful. Bren swung Brindle back, but the steel arm's small correction came at the same moment, closing the high edge they had meant to use. They were forced lower. Not far. Far enough. Boots slid. The raised strip disappeared behind them in a brown smear of dust and sunlight. Dathan's cart kept moving at the far berm, calm as a man rolling luggage through an airport. That made Bren want to hit something. It also told him hitting something would be a luxury. The machine had not punished panic. It had punished his read. He stopped them in the dust basin below the high lane, leash tight, Brindle pressed against his thigh and breathing hard through the hot grit. Bren looked back at the residue patch. Then at the actual route, the low service cut, the fresh drag mark, the crewman stepping aside as the component line advanced. The cue had been true. His interpretation had been wrong. That was the kind of failure that did not let a man hate the dog, the dust, or the machine. Nice of it, really, to leave him only himself. "He is marking the edge, not the enemy," Bren said, quieter than he liked. Marin heard it. Oren heard it. Worse, both understood it. Brindle checked Bren's hand, quick and uncertain, as if the dog felt the bad current move through him. Bren softened his grip by a fraction. The team had lost the high lane, lost time, and lost the little clean trust that came after a rescue. Ahead, Dathan's crew widened across the low route, bodies placed where machines could make them matter. Behind, the high side sat cut off by heat, dust, and Bren's mistake. The next path was not open. It was waiting to be blocked. Dathan's crew blocked the low lane before Bren could turn the mistake into movement. 3 men, maybe 4 through the dust, spread across the service side approach with the casual spacing of workers who had been told where to stand and not why it would matter. They did not raise weapons. They did not shout. They did the more useful thing. They occupied the ground the team needed next. One man dragged a wheeled stand into the rutted path. Another knelt near a plate and made a show of checking it, shoulders square to the root. Dathan stayed back by the recovery cart, visible enough to be ordinary, distant enough to be clean. The MGA-7 gave another dull shift somewhere behind the cradle frame. Bren felt it more than heard it, a low complaint through the dust under his boots. The team was lower now, late and down in bad footing because of his read. Brindle held at Bren's left, body angled between the crew and the softer ground, but the dog's breath had gone rough. The heat had worked into him, into all of them. Bren could see it in Oren's blink, Marin's tight mouth, the way dust stuck to sweat and made every face look older. Bren read the block as a shape, not as a fight. The men had left a gap that looked passable from the high side and stupid from below. Low dust, steel vibration, a rack of plates at the service cut, the arm behind them still ticking itself warm. A path that invited a rush and then stole balance. Very generous. Humanity kept inventing newer ways to make traps look like shortcuts. High side, Bren said, even though the high side was behind them now and half cut off. He meant eyes up, weight careful, no drifting lower. A crewman shifted the stand 2 inches with his boot, just enough to turn the gap into a funnel. Another man stepped in beside him, shoulder angled away from Bren, hands empty, posture casual, boots planted where the dust trace wanted to continue. To anyone up on the rail, it would look like a work crew clearing a hazard. From below, it was a wall that had learned to breathe. Brindle braced when the nearest crewman stepped toward Marin's line. The dog did not lunge. Good. Bren did not need teeth. He needed edge. The leash tightened, and Brindle's paws dug into dust that wanted to slide under him. Marin started to move toward a marker, post half buried near the service cut, and Bren almost snapped her back by reflex. He stopped himself half a beat late. She saw it. Of course she did. The cradle mark continues there, she said, pointing without crossing. Under that stand. Oren looked, then shifted to see past the blocking bodies. The crewman shifted too. Not much. Enough. Oren moved first, not charging, just stepping to mark the load path with his own body where the dust trace met the low root. He was trying to make the bad line visible for Bren, for Marin, maybe for himself. The steel arm gave a low, settling thud behind them. Everybody flinched except Brindle, who held and shook dust from one ear. Oren's boot slid on the powder-soft edge. The crewman with the stand did not hit him. He leaned his shoulder into the space Oren needed, a worksite bump, plausible, ugly. Oren went down to one knee and caught himself with a hand on the hot ground. His face changed before he made a sound. Compromised then. Not broken. Compromised was enough. Bren stepped to cover the angle, and 2 crewmen adjusted at once, crowding without touching, turning his own body into another obstacle if he chased them. Cute trick. Dirty, but not dumb. Tessa Varn came in from the observation edge at a hard angle, staying high until the last safe step, eyes on feet instead of faces. Oren can move, she said. Not fast. Brindle is heating. Marin stays on markers. Bren, you cannot pull all 3 of them. It landed harder because she did not dress it up. No procedure, no comfort. Just the bill. Marin crouched near the half-buried marker and brushed dust with 2 fingers, exposing a scrape line that ran under the wheeled stand. They covered the track, she said. Not all of it. Bren wanted one clean body, one clean command, one clean lane. Greedy wish. He had a tired dog, an injured friend, a trainee who saw what he had missed, and Tessa naming limits like she charged by the truth. Fine. Better than clean. Marin, call the markers, he said. Do not cross them. Oren, talk weight only. Tessa, you own pace. Brindle stays with me. The words felt like giving away pieces of himself. Good. He had been carrying too many. Dathan's crew adjusted as soon as they heard the rolls settle, which told Bren they understood enough to be dangerous. One man dragged the stand back half a foot, opening a false invitation toward lower ground. The other leaned away, making the trap look generous. Bren did not take it. The cart on the berm crept another yard, and the dull drag of the MGA-7 route answered from the cradle zone. Still moving. Still physical. Still not some tidy problem a radio could solve. Brindle leaned into the boundary with a low breath, holding the line while dust curled around his paws. Oren pushed upright, jaw tight, one leg not taking weight cleanly. Tessa touched his elbow only long enough to set direction, not fuss. Maren kept her finger above the scrape line, eyes bright with fear and use. Bren looked at the blocked low lane and felt the shape of the next job. They had to trace the component while damaged. They had to do it from worse ground. And he had to stop pretending command meant doing every useful thing himself. The scrape line under the wheeled stand did not behave like a tire mark. Bren saw that before he liked seeing it. Tires wandered a little. Men wandered worse. Heavy components did not wander unless someone had given them a path and enough stolen ground to use it. The line ran wide, pressed deep in the dust, with a second shallow groove beside it, where a bracket or skid had kissed the earth and dragged grit into a hard lip. Brindle found it without drama. No growl, no heroic statue nonsense. He lowered his head, took in the metal and grease smell trapped under the dust, then followed 3 careful inches until the heat off the ground made him blink. Bren felt the leash say 2 things at once. There was something here, and the dog was already paying for telling him. Tessa watched Brindle's feet. Marin watched the scrape. Oren stood with his weight favoring one leg, jaw locked so tight it made him look older. Dathan's crew shifted at the low route, pretending to work around the team while very helpfully standing exactly where Proof might want to walk. Helpful people. Always a plague when machinery was trying to kill you. The track was not secret. It was worse than secret. It was present, public, and counting on everyone to be too busy to read it. Marin crouched beside the track and kept her hand above the ground, disciplined now, angry enough to be precise. The cradle tab lines up with this, she said. Not the loader body, the service cut. Bren followed her line with his eyes, not trusting any single thing after the wrong heat. Dog cue, marker evidence, ground pressure. 3 points before he let himself believe the shape. Oren gave a short, painful breath and pointed with 2 fingers, not toward the scrape itself, but toward the dust piled on its outside edge. Weight is pulling low, he said. Not sliding free, being guided. Toward the final path? Marin asked. Oren nodded once. Toward the only path wide enough to make that much stupidity look planned. The steel arm ticked behind them, a hot, patient sound. Bren looked past the team and caught Dathan's recovery cart turning half a yard farther down the berm. Not fleeing, advancing. The cart's tires stirred dust in little soft bursts, and each burst lined up with the same ugly direction Oren had just named. A crewman at the service cut, bent low, pulled a plate clear, and stepped back before anyone could call it anything but cleanup. The route was not a guess anymore. It had a body, and the body was too heavy to hide. A dull vibration passed through the lane, lower than the radios and meaner than conversation. The steel arm began to return, not sweeping full, just moving enough to narrow everyone's manners. Dathan's nearest crewman stepped back from the stand as if clearing space for safety, which gave Bren a bitter little moment of admiration. The man had moved the obstruction and made it look responsible. Marin leaned in as dust slid from the stand's wheel and exposed a second mark beneath it. "There," she said. They covered the transfer point. Brindle nosed toward it, then sneezed hard, dust snapping from his muzzle. He pawed once near the edge and stopped. Cue, limit, warning. Not a miracle, not a map. Bren cross-checked it anyway. Marin's mark. Oren's load. Brindle's trace. The lesson from his own failure sat hot behind his ribs. One cue could tell the truth and still get a man killed if he used it alone. "No. Sometimes two," Bren said, when Oren looked at the two grooves. Oren gave him a look that almost had humor in it. Almost. Then his bad leg shifted and the humor went back where pain stored things. The intercept route appeared in pieces. A raised strip beyond the service cut. A narrow upper edge near the steel plate rack. A low shortcut that looked faster because bad ideas often had excellent marketing. The low path carried heat shimmer over dark metal dust, the same bitter residue smell that had fooled Bren once already. Brindle angled toward the heavy track and then checked back to Bren's hand, uncertain under the pressure and the heat. Tessa saw it. "He can work that," she said. "Not fast and not long." Marin stood, careful with her boots, and pointed along the marker line she had exposed. "If we stay upper, we meet it here." Oren looked at the same place and nodded, sweat cutting a clean line through dust on his temple. "If we go low, we get ahead of it," he said. "If the ground lets us." The steel arm groaned again, and Dathan's cart moved as if the clock had become music only his crew could hear. The recovery crew opened a second gap near the final path, then closed it again behind the cart, testing how much room the heavy assembly would need. Bren looked from the faster low route to Brindle's dust-caked paws. The proof was there. So was the price of reaching it. The faster route announced itself like every bad shortcut Bren had ever seen, open, low, and bright enough to make a tired man grateful. Brindle reached the edge of it and lifted one front paw before Bren gave the next command. Not high, not dramatic, just a small shift of weight, nails barely touching the heated grit, breath going dry at the back of his throat. Bren felt the leash tighten and then go uncertain. The low path ran across a dark fan of metal dust and sun-hot residue, past the service cut and toward the final ground Dathan needed. It would save them minutes they did not have. It would also take the dog's feet, Oren's bad leg, and maybe Marin's balance if the steel arm shifted again. Dathan's cart was already beyond the easy intercept, crawling toward the final path with the patient nerve of a man who believed other people would choose speed and damage themselves doing it. Bren hated that the man might be right. Brindle set the paw down, lifted it again, and looked at Bren's hand. Not asking. Reporting. A working dog had no use for drama. Pain, though, had its own clean vocabulary. Tessa came up beside Bren, breathing hard but still watching the ground instead of the faces. Good. Faces lied. Feet confessed. She looked at Brindle's paw, Oren's stance, Marin's shoulder angle, then the low route. He can cross part of that, she said. Then he stops being useful. She nodded at Oren without softness. Oren can mark, not chase. Marin can move on markers if she keeps her eyes down. You can pull one body fast, maybe too badly, and that is how people become obstacles. No lecture. No comfort. Just the cheerful inventory of a bad day. Oren had already braced himself against a steel post, one hand on the marker line, the injured leg taking less than pride wanted. Upper edge is slower, he said. Cleaner? Bren asked. Oren looked toward the raised strip beside the plate rack, where heat still danced but did not boil off the same dark residue. Cleaner enough to hate. Marin followed the exposed marker line with her eyes. It meets the route late, she said. But it meets it. The steel arm gave a low groan behind them, and dust slid down the plates like dry water. She said it like weather, which was unfairly helpful. Weather could not be argued with. Neither could a body that was already losing. Bren looked at the low path until it became the thing he wanted and the thing he refused. There was a difference. A younger version of him would have taken it and called the cost acceptable, because younger men loved words that made damage sound tidy. Acceptable. Operational. Necessary. Fine little coffins. He had Brindle's heat in the leash, Tessa's verdict in his ear, Oren's weight held crooked against the marker, and Marin standing ready without pretending she was not scared. Team function was not a soft choice. It was the only tool left that Dathan did not control. Upper edge, Bren said. Oren's mouth twitched. Figured you would pick the annoying one. I am growing as a person. Try not to make it a habit. The joke was thin and badly timed, so naturally it helped. Bren gave Brindle a hand signal close to his thigh, short and low, and took the first step toward the upper edge. The dog followed with relief so small a stranger would miss it. Bren did not. Marin moved on the marker line. Tessa set the pace. Oren marked the edge from behind them, voice clipped by pain. The upper edge cost them exactly what Bren knew it would. Time. Dust. A yard here, 2 there, each one handed to Dathan like a receipt. The crew at the final path saw the team shift high and moved faster, no more pretending to be confused workers in a badly managed test. The MGA-7 dragged forward with a dull, ugly scrape that carried through the ground and into Bren's teeth. Brindle kept moving, but his breath came rougher now, and every pause mattered. Tessa called the pace without asking Bren's ego for permission. Hold, step, hold. Marin repeated marker positions in short bursts, keeping the team off the soft edge. Oren found the upper line with his eyes when his leg would not give him the ground to stand on. They were still a team. Damaged, hot, late, but still something that could make a choice together. Down at the final path, Dathan's crew pulled the recovery cart into a cleaner angle and opened the lane like they had rehearsed it on a paper map that did not include pain. Then Dathan reached the final path first. Bren saw the recovery cart settle at the convergence point, saw 2 crewmen open the space the heavy assembly needed, saw the steel arm begin its slow return behind them. He had preserved function. Now, function had to beat position. Dathan began the final move with no shout, no speech, no little show for the people he had nearly killed. That figured. Men who trusted weight did not waste time on theater. The recovery cart settled at the convergence point, and 2 crewmen opened a slot beside it just wide enough for the MGA-7 to drag through if the ground stayed theirs. The heavy assembly answered with a deep scrape from the cradle root, metal biting dust, dust biting back, the whole lane vibrating through Bren's boots and up his bad knee. The steel arm returned behind them, slow and broad, stealing the space a faster man would have tried to sprint across. Dathan stood near the cart, one hand low, palm turned, guiding pressure like he owned every line painted on Red Mesa. He had reached the path first. Fine. Position was not ownership. Bren had learned that late enough to be annoying. Brindle panted at his left, chest heaving, paws dusty and tender, leash tight but still alive in Bren's hand. Oren marked the upper edge from behind them, injured leg stiff. Marin watched the marker line. Tessa watched bodies. Bren watched where all of them met. High side, Bren said. Not loud. Loud would only make tired people look for a leader instead of ground. Brindle moved first, because that was the job he still had left. The dog set himself across the boundary line, not lunging, not threatening, just becoming a hard fact with teeth and a tired body. His front paws held the strip where the high edge met the final path. The boundary rag snapped under one paw, a small cloth sound under all that machinery, and Bren felt the old opening moment come back crooked and useful. Oren saw the same line and dragged himself half a step farther, shoulder braced against a post, hand down to mark where the weight could not be allowed to roll. There, he said, pain chewing the word down. It needs that shoulder of ground. Maren was already moving, not brave in the stupid sense, not fearless, better than that. She caught the loose marker tab and pulled it into view, showing the edge Dathan's crew had tried to bury under dust. Tessa caught Oren's elbow before his bad leg folded and snapped. Hold him high. Do not crowd the dog. High. Nobody had room to be graceful. Grace could file a complaint later. The first denial almost held. Almost was the worst word in any range, because it sounded close enough to forgive and killed you anyway. Dathan's crew adjusted the cart angle, not much, just enough to make the low pull bite again. The MGA-7 lurched, one ugly inch toward the slot, and Brindle's line went hard as cable. The dog held, shaking, but the heat had taken something out of him. His front paw skipped once on the dusty strip. Oren tried to mark the shoulder wider, and his injured leg buckled. For half a second, his body became the obstacle Tessa had warned about. She caught him high, braced him against the post, and snapped, "Oren stays up or we lose the edge." Maren saw the marker tab start to fold under the drag and lunged only as far as the safe strip allowed, pinning it flat with one hand, while her other hand pointed the true line for Bren. A crewman stepped into Bren's next path, empty hands lifted like innocence. Cute. The man's boots were not innocent. They were exactly where Dathan needed Bren to step. Bren stopped before the trap could use him. Bren saw the route then, as a machine would see it. Not good, not evil, just available or denied. The MGA-7 needed the low pull, the cart's angle, the open shoulder Oren had marked, and 2 human bodies out of the way. Dathan still had 3 of those things. He did not have the 4th, and Bren was done trying to be all 4 himself. "Do not stand where the machine wants you," Bren said, and stepped into the pressure line, not to fight a man, not to stop steel with bone, because that would be idiotic, and therefore probably popular somewhere. He used his body to point the team, not replace it. Maren, marker to Brindle. Tessa, keep Oren up. Oren, call wait. The steel arm groaned and the assembly lurched again. Brindle held, breath ripping dry through his mouth. Maren drove the marker line straight enough for Bren to see the stolen ground turn visible again. Oren barked, "Low pull is dead if that edge stays closed." Bren cut across the crewman's next step with his shoulder and presence. No flourish, just enough denial to stop the path becoming a path. Tessa shifted Oren a foot higher, and the movement kept his bad leg from sliding into the root. The MGA-7 dragged sideways, bracket grinding against the wrong lip. Metal screamed once. Then the component jammed hard against the cradle skid, and the upper edge, trapped in the ground, Dathan no longer controlled. The stop was ugly, which made Bren trust it. Clean stops were for sales videos and other organized lies. This one kicked dust into every mouth, shook the steel arm into a forced pause, and left the MGA-7 tilted against the edge, with one housing crushed enough to end the question. Dathan stared at it for half a second too long. Not rage. Math. Bad math, finally. His crew stopped moving when the object stopped giving them somewhere to go. Sight voices rose from the observation side, late and official, useful now that the living had already done the rude part. Tessa lowered Oren to the safer strip, not gently, efficiently. Marin stood with the marker in both hands, dust on her face, and no trust left for painted lines. Brindle sagged against Bren's leg, exhausted, muzzle hot, eyes still on the boundary, because nobody had told him the world was allowed to relax. Bren crouched and put one hand on the dog's shoulder. The review would come. Oren's leg would be worse by evening. Marin would remember the space the machine had taken from her. Dathan would be contained by the thing he failed to move. The machine had not missed. They had. Then they had learned fast enough to make the ground say no.